Now, our next witness, again, has anonymity and is to be known as Mrs. Yu. So, in the same way as this morning I make an order in her case, and it reads as follows, in words which will be becoming increasingly familiar to you. The name and address of witness W0136, that's Mrs. Yu, to you and me. The name of her husband who died, the names of her daughters, and the name of any other member of her family, and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of her appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by me or by the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness W0136 must be referred to only as Mrs. Yu. The order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered. And I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. Well, with that introduction, may we have Mrs. Yu, please?
Mrs. Yu, your full name is known to the inquiry. Could you please take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Mrs. Yu, you're here to talk about your late husband, and we've agreed that it's too hard for you to talk about him without referring to him by name. You'll be talking about the effect of his illness and his death on you and your daughters, who you're also going to name. And the people in this room will hear those names, but they mustn't be repeated. When the audio recording goes up on the live stream on the website, the names will all be removed from the recording to ensure that your anonymity is protected. But you and I are going to use all of those names for today. Okay. We're going to be talking about your husband. When did you and Peter meet?
Well, when we started working in the civil service, I was 16 and he had just turned 17. And we started going out right away. He was a very gentle man, and I remember his ambitions were to do well at work, and down the line he wanted a detached house, a car and a large pedigree dog, and earn enough money to have a really good life. And he said he was going to start saving, and would we like to get married? So that's how we met.
And you married in 1969?
That's correct.
And you've given the chair and myself a photograph of him before he was ill, but for obvious reasons we won't put that up, but we've seen it.
Yes.
You married in 1969, and then in early 1980 you moved house.
That's correct.
What did you notice about Peter at about that time?
Well, he'd taken time off work to help settle into our new home, and he was painting the lounge and it was taking forever. And he was lethargic and very tired. And I thought he should maybe go and get checked up, as pernicious anemia ran in his family. So he made an appointment, went to the doctor, and he was sent straight into the Royal Infirmary. and they did some tests. I think they did a bone marrow at that point, and perhaps gave him blood. And they said there was anomalies in his blood, and they would keep an eye on him. And that's how it started.
Then about a week later, you went to your family doctor, your family GP. What happened then?
Had tonsillitis, so we got an emergency appointment, and it was the old doctor that I'd never seen before. And after checking her out and giving a prescription, he asked if the girls could go into the waiting area and count the fish in the fish tank. Of course, there was alarm bells going off. And when they left, he said to me, they'd had a meeting that morning, a doctor's meeting, and they discussed my husband's case, and he felt it was his duty to tell me that he had acute myeloid leukemia and he would die, but I mustn't tell him. I don't really remember going home, but he kept asking me, is there something wrong? I was going, no. But after a week, I just couldn't keep it in. And I went to bits and told him. And he was absolutely furious. And he went into the Royal Infirmary. And he was told that he had a bone marrow aberration. 1 in 3 goes into leukemia. And their advice to him was forget it and get on with your life. So I don't really know. They're just so different. And I now wonder, does everyone die who has acute myeloid leukemia? It just seems quite a strange thing to have been told.
A little while after that, he did start treatment.
He did. He used to go in and have his blood checked, and then he used to go to a room where the haemophiliacs were given blood, and he would get a top-up, as he called it. I'm not sure how many times he went. I just can't remember.
And he ultimately had blood, platelets, and some chemotherapy.
Yes.
During that time, who was treating doctor?
Dr. Ludlam.
And what was your relationship like with him?
Well, initially it was in a room on his own, and I didn't really see Dr. Ludlam very much. We always used to talk a lot. So when I went in to visit him in the afternoon, he would tell me the last 24 hours news, and then I would tell him all my news. But as time went on, he got tireder and started going into himself. And I think it was the autumn of 92 that I was going along the corridor and met Dr. Ludlam. And he was concerned that I'd lost quite a lot of weight. So he said, "My office now." And I went along and he asked me what was going on. And I said that he wasn't really telling me much. In fact, his nature had changed by then. He had gone into himself. And there was a look that would come on his face that was like, when I asked him things like, "Don't go any further, I don't want to discuss this. I'm too tired, I'm too exhausted. Tell Mum and Dad not to come in." And occasionally he would say, "Don't bring the girls in, I just don't want them to see me like this." And I said to Dr. Ludlam, "I just don't really know what's going on. And I need to know what's going on, because that's the only way I can cope." And he promised he would keep me abreast of what was going on. He would tell me the truth. And I used to pop along to his office, and he said, "Just pop in." Actually, I called him Chris. And I would pop in and his secretary would say, oh, he's not in at the moment, I'll make you coffee and I'll try and find him. And he would always come along and have a chat. And because he was so ill, it was like a lifeline. And he became a knight in shining armour. Because I always knew I could just go and ask.
Because by then, had done some outpatient treatment, and then he was now an inpatient in the hospital.
He was an inpatient, he'd been in there for a while.
He was in isolation on his own for a very long time by then.
Uh-huh.
When he started having the transfusions of blood and other products, are you aware of whether he was ever warned about any risks involved in receiving the transfusions?
I don't think he was, because I'm sure he would have told me.
And by then was in hospital, and his health declined quite quickly.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I remember in April 1983 when I saw the contaminated blood scare in the papers. By then, he was skeletal, really. His skin was a strange colour, and also his eyes. He'd lost his hair, which was his crowning glory and upset him enormously. He also had oral thrush, which was horrendous. And I was led to believe that was caused by chemotherapy. And it was so bad, they put a Hickman line into his heart. I believe he was photographed and put in the journals, and it was quite a thing to have this done. He also had a cough, at one point coughing up blood because we had to wear masks. His nature had changed, he was very depressed. Is that about all? And with hindsight, I think he actually had AIDS then.
When his skin changed colour, and you saw in the press about AIDS, what did you do?
I panicked straight down to the Royal Infirmary to see Dr. Ludlam. And when I asked him about it, he said, you don't need to worry. Blood's been irradiated and it's perfectly safe. And I believed him.
By Christmas 1983, he was really very unwell.
Yes.
With the severe thrush and a horrible cough.
That's right.
Dr. Ludlam was keen for him to come home for a short time.
Actually, I think at Christmas he'd actually asked me to go in for a chat. I've forgotten about a lot of this because I've buried it so deep. And he actually gave him a 10% chance of getting through Christmas. But it was a terrible Christmas going in to see him coughing like that. His face racked with pain. I think in the evening when I went in, I was in with the girls in the afternoon. When Dad and I went in the evening, my dad cried like I've never seen him cry. He was just so horrified at what he was going through. And at that point, on the way home, he stopped the car and he said, from now on, I'll go in on a Sunday and you do something nice with the girls. Because it was just living in that space all the time.
Did come home for a short time around then. Can you tell us about that?
Well, that was definitely between the April 84 because I passed my driving test on the 5th. And my first journey on my own was into where he went for convalescence. And then a bit after that, Dr. Ludlam phoned me and he said he was concerned about his mental health. And he'd phoned my GP. And Dr. MacLeod had agreed to come in 3 times a day and administer the drugs through his Hickman line. And was that all right? And I said yes. It was nice to have him home. The first morning, Alec MacLeod arrived at 7:30 and got everything ready and administered the drugs. And when he came back at lunchtime, he said, "I want you to scrub up." I said, "I don't know how to scrub up." He said, "I'll talk you through it." So he did. Actually, I remember after I did it, I moved my sleeve and I got a row. I had to start again. And he taught me through the procedure of what to do. And I put all the stuff through, but I was shaking, absolutely shaking like a leaf. And then he said to me, "From now on, I want you to do it, because I could bring anything into the house and infect him." Or conversely, he was safeguarding his patients. I don't know which is the truth. But at tea time, I found it really stressful. The girls were watching Blue Peter. But I took my time to get everything on the tray. And when I started to put the first lot through, I said, "You'll need to do it slower because it's really cold." And I took some deep breaths and really focused, and I just had to cope with it.
And from then on, while he was at home, you were administering the medications.
That's right.
I should say, sir, there have been some difficulties tracing Dr. MacLeod, but he has now been asked to provide a response, and anything that's received will be published in due course. Because you've had some concerns about why Dr. MacLeod was asking you to do the medication.
Yes, I would have thought a district nurse would have been able to do that. And then I started my supply of these 3 bottles of drugs that were kept in the fridge. They were running out, so I phoned Dr. MacLeod. We seemed to have a flag up that if I phoned, I got put through. And asked him for a repeat prescription, and he said he couldn't give me one because it was illegal. So I phoned the ward and spoke to the sister, and she said that she couldn't give me a prescription or a supply of them. So Dr. Ludlam was spoken to, and he said I would have to go in every few days and pick up a batch, and that's what I did.
After a little while, you had to go back into hospital.
Yes.
And what was the situation then?
Well, he'd had quite a lot of chemotherapy treatments, and he'd gone into remission for short spells. And a while after that, Dr. Ludlam phoned me again, and he said that he was concerned about again, and there was a new chemotherapy treatment in America. He'd exhausted all the ones here, and there was a new one in America, and the NHS had agreed to fund it, but it was experimental, and he'd spoken to people. It was like his last chance, really. So he'd agreed. So he wanted me to book a caravan so we could go on holiday, and he'd just come out and sit in the sun and go back in when he was tired. And the school holidays were coming up. So I put all that in place, and the plan was when the girls came home from school on the Friday, that I would take them and our large boisterous dog over to Mum and Dad's. We'd have a couple of days to recover. And then the girls were going to come home on the Sunday, And we'd have 5 days at home and then a week in the caravan. And then I went down to pick up. And the sister, her last words were, will you keep an eye on his eyes? And if the hemorrhage, you must bring him straight back in. So when we got home, it was just exhausted. So got him up to bed, and he just crashed out. The following morning when I woke up, I was lying looking at his ravished body, just thinking, it's just not really, sorry. When he opened his eyes, they were both hemorrhaged. And so I had to tell him. I said, I'll need to go and phone the ward and say you're coming back in. When I phoned, the sister says, get him in as quickly as possible. I got ready very quickly, but I found I just couldn't lift or help to sit up. It was as if the fatigue just had floored him. So I had to go and get a neighbour to come and help. And he was so shocked. He was crying. But we managed to get him down the stairs and into the car. Because we didn't want the ambulance because it was too painful. So I drove into the infirmary. And you go down the brae. And you're not really meant to do that. And the guy came to book me and took one look at me and said, oh, put your car on the pavement and I'll get the wheelchair. So he took her up to the room. I brought his bag. And the sister asked me to go and get a coffee and come back in an hour while they did tests. I was a bit upset going up and sitting in the cafe. And then after an hour, you've got to just steel yourself and go back. But as I walked past the sister's office, she called me in. And she told me that he was dying, but I mustn't tell him. And that I should phone his parents and say if they want to see their son alive, they must come now, but they can only come in at visiting time. And they mustn't tell him he's dying. The same in relation to the girls. I do remember walking up towards the phone boxes. There's 4 phone boxes and there's a low wall that all the winos used to sit on. And I went into the phone box to make the most difficult phone calls of my life. There was a party going on outside. And when I phoned, I think she was horrified. And she said her usual retort. And I said, the sisters told me to tell you I've got to go because I've got to phone the girls. I phoned my mum and her response was the opposite. Just keep praying and everything will be all right. When I came out the phone boxes, all the guys sitting there obviously realised that I was in a state. So they all got round me and were saying, you want a wee drink and you'll be all right. So I went back down to the room and he was totally unconscious. I thought at first he was asleep and I spoke to him and I took his hand, but there was no response. And I talked to him. I went and stood at the window for a while, just looking out, and then I went back and spoke, and was really no response. I wondered if he was maybe in a coma. And then the door opened and Dr. Ludlam came in with 2 students. And he probably asked me how I was, but I couldn't say, well, I'm not. But so stirred at the deep male voices, and they had a brief chat. And Dr. Ludlam and the students left. And Peter looked at me and he said, "Why are you here? It's not visiting time." And I said, "Oh, the girls are coming in later, and I'm waiting to take them home." And he kind of just lay back, shut his eyes, and went to sleep. But minutes later, he took the rigors really strongly. That had happened before, and I had to go and get the nurse to get the tinfoil blanket. But of course, when I went out, they were clearing away, all the nurses were clearing away the tea, and there was no nurses to be seen. But Dr. Ludlam was just down, so I ran down and said to him, and I ran back to his room, and he was already dead. He'd had a massive brain hemorrhage.
He died at the age 36. Your daughters then arrived. Can you tell us about that?
The sister waylaid my mum and dad and said to the girls, "I'll just take you in here for a moment." And she brought mum and dad along to me. And then she went back to her room and said to the girls, "Your daddy's died and gone to heaven. You'll have to be good for your mummy." And then she brought them along to the room. My youngest daughter screamed and ran out. I can't remember any of that. It says that Dad was in death throes, his eyes were open, his mouth was open, and it was horrific. I'm afraid I've blocked that out completely.
Your mother and father-in-law arrived, and then after a little while you all left.
We left.
The death certificate recorded that he died of acute myeloid leukemia.
That's correct.
And you and the girls were devastated.
Absolutely devastated. I mean, at that age, you're looking forward to going on holiday with your dad, who's been in hospital all that time. And it's cruelly taken away.
You went to see Dr. Ludlam about 7 years after he died. Why was that?
Well, I often reflected on the callousness of the way we were treated, we were all treated that day. And I decided that I wanted to go and share my experience with him because I felt it wasn't right. And I took him through that day, and he said I was right, that things needed to change. And then he asked how the girls were, and I said, well, we've all gone into ourselves. We were a family that were always together and talked all the time, but it was just too painful. And then he asked how old they were, and he said I could arrange some family counselling, but I think it's been too long. It'll probably start surfacing in their 40s. He did arrange the family counselling, and it just didn't happen.
Some time after that, you were visiting a gentleman in the hospital. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I went back to work about 6 years after he died, and I met, and we were both on our own. We both liked the countryside, so we started hill walking. Then we went for some meals, and then he said he was going down to see his mum in Cumbria, and he said it would be nice to get engaged. Would you like to come down and meet her? So the morning before we were going, he phoned me up and said, "Oh, I'm really ill. I'm just so ill. You just have to come now." So I rushed over, and yes, he did look very ill. And I phoned the doctor, and the doctor came and said, "Oh, it's a mild heart attack, but I'm going to send you into the Royal anyway." So I followed in the car, and the usual, you go and have coffee while they do the tests. And then I went back in, and we chatted, and I think it was a chap that was in charge of the ward. He said, "I'm sure things will be fine. And you'll be able to come and pick him up tomorrow and go down to Cumbria." So I went home and made the tea, and then I went back in. And when I was going back in, I met Dr. Ludlam, and he asked me why I was there after we had a wee chat. And when I told him, he said, he patted my arm and went, "Oh, he'll be absolutely fine." So, however, 3 o'clock the next morning, my phone rang, and it was the ward to say that his blood pressure had dropped significantly, and it could be indicative of a heart attack. Would I like to go in? I raced in. When I got to the ward, there was no nurses about, and then one came out a room and said, "Oh, he's had a massive heart attack, we're trying to save him." And she ran that way and got something and ran back in. Shortly after that, she came out and said she was sorry. He'd gone.
Then a few years later, in about 1994, you were again in the hospital, this time visiting your mum.
That's correct.
What happened then?
I bumped into Dr. Ludlam, and we had a chat. And then he said, "Who are you visiting this time?" And I said, "Oh, it's Mum this time." And then he said, "Oh, and how's your young man?" And I said, "Oh, he died the following morning at 3 o'clock. And he was so visibly shaken, I thought it was strange. But actually, I had gone to see Dr. Ludlam in January 93 because my nephew had been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. My daughter's only cousin, my only nephew. I just couldn't believe that this could happen again. And at that point, acute myeloid leukemia was the symptoms that my husband had presented. And I was thinking, oh God, my poor nephew. And I'm thinking, well, that's 9 years. So I phoned Dr. Ludlam up and said, could I come in and have a chat? It was just to see how treatments had progressed and what was the prognosis. And I think that's important in the story further on.
Thank you for adding that in. So you'd spoken to him about your nephew, and then in 1994 you've had the conversation when you were visiting your mum, and he looked visibly shaken.
Shaken, yeah.
You were then phoned by Dr. Ludlam.
That's correct.
And what did he say?
He said, I need to talk to you. And I said, you are talking to me. What is it? What is it now, you know? And he says, no, I need you to come in. I said, well, I need you to tell me now. And he says, no, come in tomorrow at 10 o'clock. So 10 o'clock the next morning, I was in his office. And when he came in, he said, there's just no easy way to say this. Contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. And I've brought you in today to ask you if at any time on visits home, few visits home, and I always thought he would be too ill, did you ever make love? And I said, yes, just the once. And he said, well, I'll have to test you. God, it was like the bottom falling out your world, because all I could think of was, oh my God, what if I've given that to the girls? And that's the only thought I had in my head. And he took the blood, and I said, does it not take about a week? He said, no. He said, remember, I'm head of haematology. As soon as you go, I will go straight and have it tested. So he said, go into town, have a spending spree, treat yourself to lunch, and come back at 4 o'clock. I can't remember if it was 4 or past. So I don't know where I went. And I definitely didn't have lunch. I didn't buy anything. And I was sitting waiting on him. His secretary always making me my coffee. And then he came in and said, it's all right, you're clear. And then he said he'd been to court on behalf of the haemophiliacs. He said he didn't involve me because I'd been through enough. And he would do all the forms, and down the line I would hear from the McFarlane Trust, or the Eileen Trust, I believe, is the non-haemophiliac part of it. And I think, was it August 94? The checks arrived.
When you spoke to Dr. Ludlam, he also told you that vials of blood had been kept.
Yes.
Did he say anything more about that?
He didn't know.
Why?
It made me feel physically sick, actually, to think that he still had blood 10 years after he died. The whole thing was, there's just no words to describe.
Did he explain to you why he told you about contracting AIDS at that point in time?
I think the shock was just too much for me to think on any questions. And I've never felt able to go back and speak to him because of the betrayal I felt. I remember saying to the girls, do you know, I believe I called him Chris. And it's just so, I mean, he was my knight in shining armour. He was there for me. And to be betrayed like that 10 years down the line, it was just... So I said, I think we should just shut the door on that and move forward. But then you don't realise what that does to you. The fact that you're betrayed and you're shocked, and it devalues you as a human being. You just lose your self-worth. What are you worth that you can be treated like that? And I believe he should have told us. He should have told her and I together, because I went in on my own in the afternoon. Because as a family, you would have been able to cope with that. And you would have been in charge of your own destiny. Instead of which you're robbed of that, and it just, well, your self-esteem plummets. And the girls and I have lived with the consequences of that ever since.
You've said in your statement you don't now know what complications arose from the AIDS and what was from the leukemia.
That's right.
And that's something you really struggle with.
Mm-hmm. What was the reality back then? I just don't know.
Your daughters, one of your daughters has said that the question of whether her dad was used for research torments her.
Mm-hmm.
And you've said you have a list of questions you wish you'd asked Dr. Ludlam at the time, but you haven't been able to.
Unable to.
And they are questions like, when was he infected? When did they know he was infected? And why they didn't tell you at the time?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the impact of this on your daughters as well?
Well, the aftermath of dying, you're trying to cope with a funeral, telling the schools, seeing to all these things. And then I think the girls struggled with, well, we struggled to talk about it because our grief was so intense it just couldn't be verbalised. I think to make matters worse, not long after, diagnosed with scoliosis, which meant we were going back and forward to the Princess Margaret Rose. My daughters were very close and played together, and now they were silent. And we'd gotten into the habit of eating our meals watching the telly. And I said to them, this is no good, we must start eating at the table again and talking. And there was total silence for about a month. But we couldn't really get through that barrier of grief. And yes, I think low self-esteem has played a part. Struggled. I think you both struggled.
And once you were told that they had also contracted AIDS, you said in your statement, and the girls have said in their statements, that they came to question everything and had a loss of trust in doctors whenever they had to deal with anything medical.
Well, that's true. Mm-hmm. I don't think I fully trusted anyone since. I feel myself pulling back. That level of betrayal, I don't think. And there was never any counselling offered. I think when he told me that was the opportunity to offer counselling. And I think we've all worked at that in our own way and talked about it.
All the family statements have said that many of the same questions of what was happening and why. And part of what you've tried to do since then is to get some answers to your questions by applying for medical records. Mm-hmm. What did you receive when you applied for his hospital records?
There's none. There's no records, apart from I went to the NHS archivist and she found something, but of course she couldn't tell me what it was, and it's just a test that they did on the day he died, and that's the only. But then I got a copy of all the policies from the NHS starting, and it would read in my mind that something of such medical significance would have to have been kept. But they can find no trace. And when I got the letter back from Darren Poole, the medical records office, he had put about haemophilia, which freaked me out because he wasn't a haemophiliac. I'm thinking, oh, he's gone down the wrong. But no, they say they've researched everywhere.
And for the record, I should record that Dr. Ludlam has been asked for his response, and he has indicated that a response will be provided.
Thank you.
As you've looked back to when he was ill, you've also been concerned about your interactions with Dr. MacLeod and the giving, why you were asked to give the medication. What are you now concerned about in that regard?
Well, I went in to see him just to say I thought under the circumstances he should never have asked me to do the procedure, because I was exhausted at that point and it placed an extra burden on us all. And he said, yes, but you're nothing but a bloody stupid woman. And at which point I stood up and said, well, I haven't come here to be spoken to like that. But with hindsight, I believe that he knew he had AIDS, that he possibly had known for a long time. And he thought I was stupid because I hadn't thought about it. But in actual fact, I had gone to Dr. Ludlam and asked him. And clearly been lied to.
And while Peter was ill, Dr. McLeod had also asked to do blood tests on your daughters.
That's correct.
And at the time, what did you think those tests were for?
Well, he thought they were maybe a bit anemic, but then they were always pale.
And what's your concern now about those blood tests?
Well, the girls thought they were maybe getting tested for acute myeloid leukemia, but with hindsight we now wonder if it was to see if we had AIDS or hepatitis C.
And your concern now is that not only were you not told about the AIDS, but that the GP had been told.
That's correct.
And was responding to that.
Mm-hmm. Because during my nephew's treatment, yes, he lost weight, he lost his hair, he was slimmer, but his skin was the same and his eyes were the same. So that's one of the reasons I wondered if I had Hep C.
After he died, what was your financial situation like?
Well, it wasn't good. I remember going to a solicitor because the house was in his name. He hadn't made a will. And I was told that I'd probably lose the house. I'd have to go to court. And the thought of that was horrendous. You know, I just kept thinking, oh God, we'll have to go and stay with Mum and Dad in this tiny house. But that was resolved down the line because obviously it was insured properly. I went for a widow's pension. And Mum was with me. We were in a queue at the DSS. And when I got to the top of the queue and said I'd come about a widow's pension, and the woman says, "Oh, you're so lucky." At which point I was hysterical, absolutely hysterical. I remember two people coming and ushering Mum and I into a room, bringing tea, and the reason I was lucky was Margaret Thatcher had brought in a rule that widows under 40 had to go out to work. And as it was just being phased in, I would get half a widow's pension. It's like, no, I don't want half a widow's pension. I don't want a whole widow's pension. I should just want my husband back. And people are so... they're just not trained, probably, but it's just... I was grateful to have my house, I have to say. That was quite scary. But I think we coped with what we had. So our life of luxury never arrived, but we just made the best of things.
Once you were told that you had contracted AIDS, you were then able to access some financial assistance.
Yes, the cheques from the Macfarlane Trust. Mm-hmm.
After you received that initial payment, did you receive anything else?
No.
You'd moved house and didn't think to tell them, but equally there was no indication that you were entitled to anything else or that you should be applying for anything else?
No, it was a one-off payment that you had to sign to say you wouldn't go to the press or whatever.
And then in July 2017, your daughters told you about the Scottish Infected Blood Support Scheme.
That's right.
And you applied.
That's right.
How did you find that process?
It was actually quite easy. I phoned the helpline up to ask a question. I can't even remember what it was, but they were very nice, very helpful.
And you've received payments from July 2017, but they've
That's
not
good.
been backdated in any other way?
No.
You've also had some problems with your pension. What were they?
Well, this payment wasn't supposed to affect any benefits that you were getting. And I have a guaranteed pension credit. So when I phoned them up and told them, I would say I got a bit of grief about it, and I said, well, I've got the letters here. So I read the letters out, so could I photocopy them and send them, which I did. And then I think my pension review was coming up, and the lady was quite difficult, I would think. And I told her that I was getting this payment, and she says, oh, we'll have to reduce your pension credit. And I says, oh, well, that's not how it reads, but in actual fact they did. It slightly went down, and it's just been reviewed and it's gone down again. But
So because you received SIBS payments, your pension credit was also reduced?
yes, it was also.
Those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you would like to say?
Well, I think when just 8 years after her dad died, had a lump in her breast and went to the Royal, what was it, the Western? She went to the Western, and when the consultant came in, the first thing he said was, are you daughter? Which I said to her, that's a bit unusual. So I think that's one of the things that makes you think you're kind of being watched from afar. And a neighbour who used to go to Dr. Ludlam's clinic to have her blood checked, she used to say, oh, Dr. Ludlam was asking after you. And at first that seemed a reasonable thing, but it went on for years until I finally said to her, I think that's really weird. I mean, he's got all these patients. He should be concentrating on them. It's really weird that he's still asking. So
Thank you. Sir?
I have no questions, but I would like to thank you for that careful and compelling account, which has obviously not been easy for you to give. Thank you very much indeed.
thank you. Is that mine, is it? Oh, my glasses. I forgot to have some water.
Miss Fraser-Butlin, we'll start again for our final witnesses at 2:30.
Thank you.
2:30.